So, hi everyone. I am Rohit. I'm one of the co-founders of YLAC, that is Young Leaders for Active Citizenship. We work to deepen citizen engagement in India's democracy and build the capacity of young people to lead change. This discussion today is being organized as a three-part digital parliament series by YLAC in collaboration with Twitter India, and will focus on the issue of revival of the Indian economy. We have a very accomplished panel with us today. I want to begin by thanking them all for taking the time, especially on a Friday evening, and I'm sure all of them have very busy schedules. So thank you so much, panelists. I wanted to start with a quick introduction of the different members on the panel before we go into specific questions around the discussion. Right? So let me actually take the opportunity to first introduce Mr. Vaishnav. Mr. Ashwini Vaishnav is a member of parliament representing the state of Odisha in Rajya Sabha. He is a member of the BJP, that is the Bhajpa. In parliament, he sits on several committees, including the Joint Committee on the Personal Data Protection Bill 2019. He completed his MTech from IIT Kanpur and then went on to serve as an IS officer in different capacities between 1994 and 2008. Initially as a collector in Balasore and Cuttack districts and later in the PMO under Prime Minister Vajpayee. He holds an MBA from the Wharton School. We are also joined by Professor Gowda. Professor Gowda served as a member of parliament in the Rajya Sabha from 2014 to 2020, representing Karnataka. He is a member of the Indian National Congress and established and is chairman of the Congress Party's research department. Professor Gowda has served as a director on the Central Board of the Reserve Bank of India from 2011 to 14. He has a PhD in public policy and management from Wharton. He was also chairperson IIM Bangalore's Center for Public Policy from 2009 to 13 and launched the pioneering India Women in Leadership program. Then we have Ms. Soumya Kapoor Mehta. Ms. Mehta is the head of IWIJ, the initiative of what works to advance women and girls in the economy, where she leads efforts to generate, leverage, and synthesize evidence on women's economic empowerment. Prior to joining IWIJ, she was working as an independent policy bank, UNICEF, the Government of India, the Center for Policy Research, and the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA. Soumya has a tripos degree from the University of Cambridge in economics and an economics degree from Stephens College, Delhi University. Thank you, Soumya, for joining us. Finally, we have Professor Krishnamurthy, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research, CPR, and she's an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at Ashoka University. Her long-standing area of research interest involves understanding the institutional dynamics of the state, market, and economy in contemporary India. At CPR, she is engaged in building up a new initiative on state capacity. She is a non-resident visiting scholar at the Center for the Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania. She's trained at Harvard University, the University of Cambridge, and University College London, where she completed her PhD in anthropology. So I think that's some really great series for the four panelists here. So thank you so much for taking the time. The way we wanted to, as I was discussing, the way we wanted to do this discussion is that there are a bunch of questions we would like our panelists to cover. So I'll start with the first question and direct it to a certain person, but then the other panelists can feel free to come in as and when appropriate, right? So Mr. Vaishnav, let me start with you with the first question. So given the latest GDP numbers for the last quarter, how worried should we be? And would you see a sharp recovery in the coming months as the economy opens up?
Rohit, thanks a lot. We really have a very distinguished panel of economists and anthropologists, and it's a great honor to be with all of you. So Rohit, the way economy has been ravaged by COVID, it's definitely a matter which needs a lot of effort to bring it back into normalcy. And what we are seeing here is not something which is unique to India. The economies all over the world, countries which had lockdown, countries which did not have lockdown, the countries where economy was strongly growing, or the countries where economies had weakened, almost each and every country has been affected. The key point is what is important for India and what are the policy initiatives which needs to be taken for bringing Indian economy back to normal. So I'll focus on that, and to understand where we stand today, we definitely need to understand what are the root causes of where we are today, right? And I don't, definitely it's not a political debate, as right in the beginning you said. We don't want to make it political. I'll give my economic understanding of GDP. So fundamentally, our economy, as you well know, was growing primarily driven by investment. And that cycle had started when the Golden Quadrilateral and the Rural Roads program was initiated by Prime Minister Vajpayee way back. And that cycle kind of, initially that was a kind of slow uptick in investment. And by like around 2004, 2005, when the multiplier effects of those investments started being visible, that was the time when there was a real strong, robust growth in investment. That is what fed into the consumption cycle. And that was a virtuous cycle which carried on for a while. Then came the great financial event of 2008. All of us are aware of it. That caused a massive, major fall in the investment all over the world. Nothing unique. We did come out of it, and the robustness once again started getting visible. Somehow around 2012, around 2011-12, certain judgments of the Honorable Supreme Court, especially the Spectrum case happened, then the coal deallocation happened, and before that the retrospective tax thing had happened. So since I was working with large multinationals at that point of time, I remember the kind of discussions we were having. So the investment sentiment suddenly started, first it started dampening, then it went significantly down. And I just, instead of just making it a statement, if you permit me, I'll just show the numbers, because numbers tell the story better than just the words, right? So okay, so if you look at the investment numbers, this is India's gross fixed capital formation in nominal terms. From 12-13 first quarter, the things started going down from 17% to 12% to 8%. Then it remained at 8, 7, 6, came down all the way to 4%. Then the base effect took in, then it went up to 10%. Then it once again came down to a 4-3-2 kind of percentage, right? So this is the period which is a real matter of concern. I'm not blaming anybody, any political points here. It was a mix of various things, a mix of various judgments of Supreme Court, and a lack of policy response to it, which various people have called in various terms, which caused a real flight of investor sentiment out of India. Where was the investment coming? Investment was coming into infrastructure. It was coming into power sector. It was coming into telecom sector. It was coming in airlines. Investment was coming in airports. It was coming in a variety of sectors, and all these sectors had a lot of social dimension also. I know personally during that period how many hospitals were built, how many new medical colleges were being built, how many investment was kind of flowing in every sector, whereas because of a certain phase, things started going down. And that, if you look beyond that, there was an initial buoyancy in the investment cycle once again when the government changed, and there was a sense of positivity around, and a counter-cyclical increase in the interest rate by Professor Rajan and his successor, Professor Patel, Dr. Patel, they are not professors, Dr. Patel, they, both of them somehow copied the US Fed model of inflation targeting. And I'm sure many of us in the government, I'm sure Professor Gowda also would have given at that point of time his opinion that that was the time when a feeble investment has started coming up, and if the interest rate increases, then what would happen? What happened is, naturally what happened, investment once again started flowing down. So this is the root cause, in my opinion, the weak investment environment in the country. This is the weakness, structural weakness with which we have entered the COVID crisis. In my opinion, this is the structural weakness which needs to be solved. How do we solve it? To solve it, we cannot really rely on the private investment at this point of time. Private investment will come. It will always, we have seen any country in the world, private investment is not the horse which starts pulling the economy as the first horse. It is always a horse which follows the government investment. So my recommendation here is, and my understanding of the economy here is, we will have to come with a cycle where we raise much larger public debt, and my sense is that we can easily, we have enough fiscal space, although there can be a debate on this, but I believe that there is enough fiscal space. We use that public debt to construct infrastructure, not only economic, but also social infrastructure. Then we should have a slightly different model compared to what many other countries have done. Many other countries have fallen into a debt, very high debt to GDP ratio by not monetizing those assets. I would say we should get into a benign cycle where we raise money, we raise debt, we construct infrastructure, we monetize those assets. The funds which come out of monetization, we should repay the public debt. I believe that if we can get into this cycle, it will be a sustainable, benign cycle, virtuous cycle, which will once again kindle the consumption, which will once again bring the private investment back into play, and which can really bring the economy back into growth cycle. So that's my initial comment. And after the panelists speak, I can share more.
Shall I go next?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Right. So while I certainly and naturally disagree with my former colleague Ashwini Vaishnav's analysis of the root cause of India's challenges, I would like to point out that there is one thing that we should really focus on, which is the current situation and the future. All right. And this idea about private investment driving growth is nice, but the root trigger of growth will be increased demand, consumption demand. And for that to happen, if there is increased consumption demand, then you will see private investment following. You will see capacity being fully utilized and more investments coming into play. So right now, that demand is nowhere on the horizon because a very large number of people have lost jobs. And we've also seen a situation where the kind of recovery that needs to be initiated by the government, we're not seeing the kind of investment that is absolutely and urgently required at this point in our economic history. So what do I mean by all this? I mean that ultimately, if this is a standard Keynesian solution to when economies are in tailspins, are in depression, etc., which is a massive public investment, infrastructure. On these grounds, I would say whatever Ashwini Vaishnav is suggesting is something that I would happily agree with, right? But why aren't those resources coming forth? And this is where the government is really missing the boat. And basically, you have a situation where the announcement is 20 lakh crores, but the actual additional fiscal infusion is less than 10% of that. This is not the time for the government to be pulling off jumlas like that. It's not how you're going to revive confidence in the economy and get people to start spending rather than saving. Now, the danger is when you see the chief economic advisor and others trying to talk things up by saying we will have a V-shaped recovery. A V-shaped recovery means that yes, we've had a very sharp contraction, nearly 24% drop in GDP over the last quarter, but a V-shape would mean we'd catch up very, very quickly. Unfortunately, that is, again, they're either delusional or they're trying to fool the rest of us. And the RBI governor has already made that point that V-shaped recovery is unlikely because, the effects of the lockdown are much more protracted. A lot of jobs have not only been lost, a lot of businesses have shut down. Once things start moving back to the new normal, it's not automatic that businesses will revive, that animal spirits will revive. And therefore, it's going to take a long time before, and if we're lucky, with the right policy interventions, we'll start to see a gradual recovery. The danger is that we may actually see what's called a K-shaped recovery, where some sections of the economy pick up and move back to normal. So that's the part that that moves up, upward vertically, or with an angle. But there are many others who have lost their jobs, who have lost their livelihoods, who are cutting consumption, experiencing malnutrition, whatever else, right? Those people are going to actually see a worsening of their economic situation. And if that happens, we're in for even social unrest. So it's actually vital that the government summons up the courage to say, let us be creative. Let us figure out how to raise resources, possibly by, for example, following Ajit Ranade's suggestion of taking all the government's public sector shares and pledging that to raise money from the market. So things like that is, we need creative solutions. I think the government is very concerned about the fiscal deficit ballooning way beyond our ability to manage as an economy. But at least here, if you take that chance, you could revive the economy. If you don't take the chance now, for a year later, 2 years later, when everything is shut down, you will have to borrow and you will have to come out with bigger fiscal deficits. Please take that chance now. Don't worry about rating agencies. Given the state of the world and how bad every economy is, India will be one of the better, faster growing economies if we make the right moves now. So let's not worry about issues like FRBM, and let's just go in there and provide the kind of boost to ensure that we actually see a recovery and that we don't face one more negative downslide. This government has given us demonetization, it's given us a hasty GST, now it's given us a hasty lockdown, and these should not have a permanent damaging economy impact on the economy. It's very, very critical that resources are targeted very carefully. And when you do that, when you work on infrastructure, there's just so much that can be done in terms of green infrastructure, urban infrastructure, a variety of healthcare infrastructure, which can actually have very significant impacts going forward.
So thank you for your comments, Professor Gowda. And I think both of you have pointed out some interesting aspects. Capital formation, Mr. Vaishnav, you're right, has gone down, but the latest numbers suggest that the government, extra investment by the government is not making up for the decline. So, you're right, there is need for more, but the question remains, where will that money come from? And Professor Gowda's point that, it is the demand that has decreased. And I think he's hinting to the causality that unless you fix the demand, private investment is kind of unlikely to come up. But let me actually go to Professor Krishnamurthy and sort of take the point that Mr. Vaishnav, you mentioned that the government should get into this cycle of borrowing money, investing in, infrastructure, and then monetizing it. Does the state have the capacity to do that, or is this easier said than done? Or, what would be your comments on that? So, Mr. Vaishnav, you want to come in?
Very, very quickly, I'm saying that private investment is not the way to move forward. The way to move forward is government investment. Very, very, very clearly, I'm saying that That's the only way the consumption cycle, which will again trigger the private investment cycle, will start. So that is a done thing. I don't think there is any second comment on it.
Right. Okay. I think what I was trying to say is that, but given the first quarter numbers, the government investment has not managed to fill that gap. So we'll come to that question subsequently, that where will that additional money come from? Professor Gowda has raised suggested some ideas. We'll discuss that in more detail. But Professor Krishnamurthy, if you want to come in here and sort of add your comments.
Yeah. So first, good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me in on this conversation. I think, just the first thing is that this is a moment of unprecedented complexity and challenge. So I think it's very important, and I'm very glad to have an opportunity to have a thoughtful conversation about the economy. I think there is a clarity, I think in both the speakers have already talked about this, that the government is going to have to play the leading role. Here, there is a, robust debate amongst multiple, different economists about how are we to approach this, right? Is it, as Mr. Vaishnav says, a massive investment in infrastructure, which will then kickstart a cycle also of investment and monetization that will find a way out? Is it a focus on demand side, where you have to do a little more, at least, if not a lot more, to kickstart demand? There is an important debate also about the future trajectories for growth. Like, where are we really going to see sustainable growth from, right? Is it going to be an export-led, model of growth, where many people are saying that after both looking at the global environment of trade as well as looking at the Indian economy and our own strengths, this is going to be a challenging pathway, an important but challenging pathway. And then there is the future of demand in India. And here, I think, as Professor Gowda very rightly says, we are facing a situation where it's hard to see, right, where robust demand, domestic demand is going to come from. There's no doubt that as an economy, looking forward to the future, Indian demand, domestic demand is going to be a critical element of sustainable growth. So I would like to actually take a step back a little bit to say that I think looking ahead, there are two elements. One is the question of recovery. And I think we should be very systematic about this. There is a first focus on relief and reform and sort of repair. And then there's the recovery phase. And then we're looking at long-term structural changes and transformation which the Indian economy needs. I think it's important that we are careful about thinking about the different actions that government has to take at various points. I do want to point out at this stage itself that I think by no means is the economic distress and the welfare distress that Indians are facing concluded, right? It's not, it is something that even at the level of actually, and this is one of the key things that this whole crisis has shown us, but that we have been observing for a very long time. A very large number of Indians exist one shock away from falling close to poverty, if not into poverty still. A very large number of Indians. And I think the number that have been affected by COVID, but also who are always at the precipice of vulnerability, is very high. There has been a trade-off implicitly in the way in which we've imagined our economy between economic growth and welfare. And I think this has unraveled that social protection architecture, the trade-offs between growth and welfare, the trade-offs between growth that doesn't employ a large number of people in sustainable trajectories, leaves them unprotected, is no longer sustainable. And I think this is an important point, because I think in the first 25 years of the whole period of reform that we've seen, that has been the way in which growth has unfolded. It has not engaged or been, it has not really engaged the largest parts of the economy, right? And the largest part of the Indian population. This is important because, the first quarter numbers show something very interesting here. Agriculture is the one sector, agriculture, forest and fisheries, which showed, a positive growth of 3.25%. But for a very long time, 4% was considered some sort of haloed figure, right? And that is when we thought that agriculture was, a pretty much a basket case sector in the first place, right? What we have seen over this period is that not only, and it was not surprising resilience that agriculture has shown, it was actually expected amounts of resilience. But we've also not invested in the parts of our economy, the primary sector, the interrelated rural urban sector, that can have complex multiplier approaches as we go forward. So I think, we have to rethink a little bit the long-term strategies, the sources of where sustainable demand, sustainable jobs will be produced. I'm in no way suggesting that we do not have to build a competitive ecosystem that can compete with, the best produce everywhere in the world. I am saying that we're going to have to relook at our own strengths, but also the structural weaknesses that have for too long been, prevalent in our economy. So, and I think just to take on the point you mentioned about state capacity, I think this period has really tested, Indian state capacity at all levels. So I would say the first priority is for us to reimagine welfare, see it as central to economic development and not as a binary or in conflict with it. And secondly, I would say a lot more needs to be done both on demand side. I'm very much in favor of the suggestions on investing heavily in infrastructure. I think that's very important. Public infrastructure drives private infrastructure and private investment then, and the building of those ecosystems is very important. But I think for that, we have to understand the mechanisms of transmission. This is one of the criticisms, and I think it's true that, you focus on credit, but who are the banks going to lend to, right? It cannot be a credit push. There is the ability to absorb credit into a virtuous cycle, right? So some of these are vital, but we have to get the timing right. If you do credit at this point when people are not able to actually hire and absorb, and that's not the big problem. We have a huge financial sector problem with the NBFC. So we really do have to get the timing of these interventions right. And so I would say that's perhaps the most important thing, is to have this phasing worked out, because you are going to need complex and coordinated actions. And then, finally, I think it is extremely important, and I'm sure both, Mr. Vaishnav and Professor Gowda will have a lot more to say about the state of, state and center relations, because this is going to be very important in how we finance it. The vitality for thinking about state finances also in this context. So I'll stop here.
Great. Thank you. I think what it's very, very challenging, I think, to address this, and I'll go into a little bit more details about the tools at the government's disposal and, what are the likely challenges associated with each. But before I do that, Soumya, if I could come to you and ask you a little bit more to sort of talk to us a little bit more about the impact of the negative GDP growth across sectors, or, how it has impacted different people differently. And in your view, what are some of the groups and sectors that have been more impacted? And, for instance, the big package that the government had announced, the 20 lakh crore package, do you think that has been effective in addressing some of their concerns or challenges that they've been facing?
Yeah, thanks firstly for having me over, Rohit. It's such a stimulating panel, and like Mekhla, really excited to debate, around this in a very structured fashion. I think the first thing one has to acknowledge, and that probably gets to the root of why there is no demand and why there's no consumption demand coming, that structurally India has mostly been an informal economy. You don't have workers who, it's not like a developed China or Indonesia, where you have workers working in factories and they have some measure of social protection, social security or benefits coming to them. So even though people talk about 90% of women are in the informal sector, millions and millions of men are also in the informal sector. And so people talk about migrants actually suffering during this crisis, but the reason they suffered was because they are in the informal sector. And informal sector, the payments come either through casual wages, so you're on a day-to-day living basis, or you are actually, self-employed, like you're in agriculture. In either space, you have no measure of any, cushion, like a social security benefit, which will cushion you from the falls that Mekhla was talking about. So one health shock comes, God forbid your family gets COVID and you're in a rural area, and now it's spreading now to rural areas, even like there was a statistic on Chhattisgarh, and how it's spreading in Chhattisgarh as well. it's you're already poor. So, and that's why you're seeing these numbers on food insufficiency, etc. I mean, one of the surprising statistics is the food inflation between April and August is 9.2%, and that's the major component that poor people are spending on. So, where is the consumption demand that's going to come from? And I really liked what Professor Gowda was also explaining about the K, I mean, think about it as a K curve. I never really thought about it, but there are, of course, lots of people who would be on the downward slide. And that's what the state needs to think about in terms of, the number of people who've lost their jobs, about 120 million just in April. They're all in the informal sector. How are you going to bring them back? But having said that, I think there are of course, and you talked about groups. So besides the informal sector, since we work with women, I can say that, and everybody talks about domestic violence and women actually suffering because of, bigger losses in employment and bigger job losses, etc. I think we've also suffered at other levels. For example, there's a statistic that, compared to the last quarter, there have been 40% lower institutional births. Now, those are going to have long-term health impacts on them. Children have not been immunized, during this lockdown. So we are talking about very long-term and stretched out impacts on certain groups of the population, which is the downward sliding, curve that Professor Gowda was talking about. What can be done? I think consumption demand, I think both, Meghla described it well. It's a question of timing. One needs to do both, but one needs to also think about that if I'm going to roll out, infrastructure plans, who's going to be working in them? Currently, Narega work sites are controlled, through a panchayat. Many people don't even have a job card. They probably didn't register for a job card, but social economists are coming around and saying, make them available at the work site, get them registered at the work site. There have been also calls for an urban job guarantee scheme. Orissa has it, Himachal has it, Kerala has been doing it for a long time. So those are some of the creative things that one has to think about. In terms of stimulating the demand, the cash transfers, I mean, I happened to be involved in a cash transfer experiment about 4 or 5 years ago with Seva, and we realized that cash transfers don't work in 3 months. You have to give them for about 18 months to 12 to 18 months at a stretch for people to start pooling in their savings or income and start investing in productive assets. Because the first phase, as Meghla was talking about, is really just, just distress related, getting food on the table. Then you'll start thinking of pooling your income and buying some tools. Then you'll start thinking of better input, seeds, fertilizers. So I think all of that, even from the stimulation from the demand side, needs to come. And one final thing in terms of the fiscal issue, I mean, I couldn't resist since I'm also an economist, is that the fiscal stress is going to increase, because if it's not going to increase from the expenditure sides, it's going to increase because of the dip in the revenues. So, and we know that the government is struggling to collect GST. So either ways, the fiscal issue is not going to solve. So we might as well plunge in and say that let's open up, completely agree with Mr. Vaishnav that, investments are needed, particularly in cities where social distancing is such an issue, you don't have sanitation. We've heard stories during the lockdown that, if you were to go to a local hand pump, the woman, she would be shooed away. And these are women who have no source of tap water coming into these small shanties in the slum, and you're shooed away because you think, oh, she's a COVID patient, so she should not touch the hand pump. Now where does this woman go to fill water? So these are sort of urban infrastructure investments that are needed. Urban employment guarantee schemes are needed. So completely agree in terms of the public investments being opened up, but some demand needs to be stimulated. I mean, if this is the rate at which food inflation is going, 120 million jobs just lost in April, where am I actually going to spend on to be able to give the private sector some space, to produce more and to stimulate, further investment, etc.
Thank you, Soumya. That was really helpful, and it also gives me a good segue into the next question. That demand needs to be stimulated, and the government needs to spend more. But given the decrease in output and the direct and indirect and the likelihood that the direct and indirect tax collections will remain low, what options does the government have to sort of use the fiscal space or to expand it? So let me actually first go to Professor Gowda, and then Mr. Vaishnav, I can come to you to take your comments.
Well, absolutely, the government has to go out there and find creative ways to raise more money. And here, the central government has a very, very major responsibility. It has more weapons in its armory than state governments, which are also at the forefront of fighting the COVID pandemic. Now, state governments were assuming that and made calculations that there was a certain amount of GST shortfall that would be compensated by the central government. And now, most recently, the finance minister has basically said, sorry, we're not going to be able to give you this money. It's an act of God, and you please go borrow from the market. Essentially, this is a situation that should not have arisen ever. One, because there's a constitutional and statutory obligation to pay the states, but more than anything else, it's the center that has the capacity to raise those funds. Now, the center has the capacity to monetize the deficit. It can do that as a last resort, but it has most recently borrowed from international development, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank in China. This has been a little controversial as a result. But there are other multilateral organizations. It's a center that has the capacity to do that well. The center has benefited from 1,76,000 crores or something like that from the RBI as a dividend most recently. It's a center that has been collecting a huge amount of revenues from the cesses and surcharges on petrol and diesel, which it's a benefit from lower global crude oil prices. And it's a center that will be able to command a lower interest rate for borrowings from the market if it were to choose to do more of that. So basically, what we would want the center to do is to bite that bullet and say, okay, this is the time, like other economies that we like to compare ourselves to, we will also be a little more expansive, and we will go out there and raise those resources and expand the deficit in order to pump in the resources required to jumpstart the economy. And the center also has, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of holdings in public sector undertakings which are worth a tremendous amount in what seems like a buoyant stock market. So there is money that can be raised by pledging those shares, right? And along with all this, there are, I'm sure there are even more creative measures. There are, so there are, for example, you could postpone or even cancel the Central Vista project. But the point is that, that the center is uniquely positioned to play a very central role in thinking through how to revive the economy. So let's see action on that front, and let's see sort of bold moves. And when that happens, you will start to see, confidence even in the international domain. When people say India's got its act together, India's revival is going to pick up, and you're going to start to see more investment coming in, because we've always been the country with much more potential for growth than we have delivered on, especially in the last few years. And but compared to what's happening in the rest of the world today, we absolutely have the potential to turn things around. But as we think about how are we going to invest these resources, let's not forget those people who, as Soumya just pointed out, are one incident away from malnutrition and poverty and all kinds of other difficulties. And so we have to find ways to strengthen that social safety net, and we need to provide free food and nutrition opportunities for a much longer time without checks on who's eligible and who's not and things like that. So basically, this is the time to both have compassion as well as creativity in terms of policy solutions.
Mr. Vaishnav, if you want to come in and sort of either talk about the issue or address Mr. Gaura, Professor Gaura's concerns. Yeah.
So absolutely, there is no disagreement on the point that center has to play the pivotal role here.
Right.
That's given.
Okay.
Now, questions. Basically, there are three important points here. First is about compassion.
Right.
So I'm sure everybody on this panel would agree that the immediate release of food grains, the way that food program has been expanded, it has been absolutely no limits anywhere, and the time period also has been significantly expanded. The fundamental focus, as Mekhla very rightly put, was initially to make sure that nobody goes to bed hungry, right? And the families get the basic requirements in place. Now, the question about creativity, what Professor Gora has raised, I would like to say that the national infrastructure pipeline, which, if you look at it, it can be like 105 lakh crore overall, but the initial projects which have been already taken to a level where implementation has started or about to start. That is where the key point about demand creation is. I'll just show another picture, another slide here, so that the numbers are there with us. During the 15th August address, Prime Minister focused on the infrastructure pipeline, and the reason for that was, if you look at our central government's liabilities, I'm not looking at the complete public debt. I'm not looking at the complete public debt. I'm saying the central government liabilities have over a period of time significantly reduced. So that is what gives us the fiscal space. Now that fiscal space can be used by borrowing domestically, and I definitely prefer borrowing domestically rather than borrowing overseas. And I'm sure all the economists would agree on this. Why take the risk of forex fluctuation? With this kind of scenario and the work which has already gone in taking the NIP projects into a significant level, already there is a credible signal which is going to the industry, going to the construction companies, to steel companies, to cement sector, and all of them are in turn again moving on to their next level of demand creation. So that credible signal which went out for some time, which was in works for some time, has now gone out, and already we can see a firmness in demand for many things, and people have started going back from the villages to the work sites, and that is what will really prevent that single shock which can put a people. And I fully agree, yes, we have a large group of vulnerable population in our country where a single shock can mean life in poverty versus life in so I think that reality is very clearly known to everybody, and that is where the sustained efforts have to be made, what Professor Kapoor was saying, and we have to find those sustainable sources of growth. We have to find those sustainable sources of jobs. It cannot be 100 days job and after that what do you do, right? I say yes, that 100 days job was needed. It has been given. It has been provided to a very significantly large number. So I'm not debating that. Important is what do we do beyond that? So that beyond is what we have to now focus on. And that's what the government, in my opinion, is focusing on. Results will be visible. I don't want to go into, yes, there will be a differentiation between some sectors which will have a prolonged, for example, tourism, for example, hotel industry, for example, hospitality. These sectors will have a prolonged period of pain, and there will be other sectors where things will start improving better, quicker. So that kind of thought process every country is facing it. It's not unique to us. One example I want to give here is the countries which immediately put money into pure consumption, right? It was more like a sugar rush in those countries where there was a sudden spike, but that spike was not at all sustainable. that spike was not sustainable. But there are other countries where just before COVID or immediately during the COVID, immediately, let's say a country, one of the countries took a very large railway program. And we can see how quickly that has led to the recovery in their economy. Yes, there will be in the Indian context, we have to look at the challenges which we face in terms of the way each and every project is challenged in our country. Doing anything worth it is so difficult. Those challenges also we have to face. We cannot wish away those realities of the ground, where any project you want to construct will face its own criticism, its own set of activists, its own set of PILs, right? So that is a reality which we again have to face and then move ahead with it. But I don't think the government has even fallen short on direct cash transfer. Look at the way PM Kisan has been front loaded, and if you just look at last few years, if you compare this last few years with some of the many past years when the way farmer suicides were a recurrent theme in our discussions, and the way PM Kisan and the way agricultural investment has helped. And I don't think this, what we say, this growth in agricultural sector in this quarter is, it's not like fluke. If you look at the last budget should be called agricultural budget. It was farmers' budget. It was not even a general budget. That was the first time, at least I have been observing budgets for many years, and keep politics aside, the first time a comprehensive thought process about all aspects of agriculture was brought in. Significant amount of investment was kept for it, and most of that investment has now been front loaded. I'm sure you are aware of it. The kind of investment which is going into cold storages, into rural linkages, into rural power, into rural roads, all that is definitely going to help the agricultural economy also. So in a nutshell, both on cash transfers, on giving direct benefits to have that immediate support, on securing food security, on all these points, as well as on once again now bringing the economy back from trough into normal situation. All these steps have been taken, and I'm sure we'll see the results. Yeah, thanks.
Mr. Vaishnav, I just wanted to ask, before we sort of go on to the next panel, your comment on the center-state tussle around revenue sharing, and what kind of implications does that have?
My view is that GST was a political agreement. It was not just a contractual scenario. That is first. Second, this is a reform which is so historic, such a big thing. And I can vouch from my circles in which, and of course in the industry, the ease it has brought to all of us, it's phenomenal. I mean, the kind of hassles we had about maintaining invoices, about maintaining stock, about getting the transit permits, each one of those hassles is out. Today, e-way bill can be generated in seconds. So to that point, just for not creating an incentive for states to reverse on that, because that is going to be such a big thing for our country for decades together, that we should not let anybody even think twice on GST. Just for that, I would say that the central government should give the money entirely to state, without even going into any contractual, any details of the law or something. This is not in my humble opinion, this is the time when we should give the money to the states, because everybody needs it.
Right. One very quick comment from Professor Gowda, and then Soumya, I'll come to you about the efficacy of cash transfers that Mr. Vaishnav spoke about. Yeah.
What are you asking me to comment on?
So what Mr. Vaishnav was sharing, so he's spoken about GST sharing, he's saying that center showed, but the earlier information that he shared about, the managing of debt by the center, if you have a comment on that.
No. I let it go for now.
Okay. Okay. Soumya, do you want to come in on the efficacy of cash transfers and, its impact on the most distressed, the groups that have faced the most amount of distress?
I think, one must also appreciate that there have been significant investments that have been made in the past. I mean, India is not amongst the unbanked countries of the world after Jan Dhan. So, of course, there's been a massive increase in account ownership and, the JAM 2 also working place. So it did facilitate some of the cash transfers that went out, say, to women. So I think it did help. But there have been studies which are also coming out, which are a little worrying, that because once the Jan Dhan accounts were created, not many were active. So they were all dormant, particularly for women. So there were quite a few, although of course the majority got it, but there were still quite a few who didn't. And I think that this probably is also a time to retrospect that, although these huge reforms have come in and have kicked in and have made an impact, but what is the next step? So we have created ownership of bank accounts to be able to facilitate cash transfers. Are those accounts active? Are they dormant? Are they being used by women? Do they have even financial literacy to actually go and, fill in their withdrawal slip, etc. So actually, if we see in certain states where training programs have been taken by NGOs or even the government by the NSDC on all these financial literacy trainings, then you actually see more usage of those cash transfers that are coming in. So I think that's number one, that one needs to start thinking of this last mile delivery connects. The second is also that cash transfers don't help, particularly in a situation of a lockdown when you can't go to the bank to withdraw it. So that was also a challenge that a lot of the field studies that IWAGE has been doing, that's something that we are finding. And in this case, who comes to the fore are actually many of these women. Women self-help groups who actually start taking on roles like banking correspondents, besides, of course, the masks and sanitizers, etc., that we have been producing. And, of course, even the ASHA workers, and also there have been multiple roles that actually women have taken forth as frontline workers, besides, of course, the usual health delivery and, IEC sort of campaign roles. And I think one needs to start thinking of investing in that cadre a bit more. To facilitate these last mile delivery of cash transfers or whatever schemes that the government has. And we've been doing a study on frontline workers, and what we are finding is, of course, that there are still many vacancies for ANMs, for Anganwadi workers, and of course, there's been a debate about the ASHA worker incentives. And these are people who are really putting their lives on the front line and actually going and spreading messages, only getting violence in return. So there have, though those are some last mile sort of challenges that need to be ironed out before we start thinking about, bank accounts or, even the cash transfers. Having said that, I think a long-term sort of a cash transfer, maybe like an emergency basic income, is something that a lot of people are talking about. And that may be, poverty lines, of course, is something that now nobody really uses. But maybe you could actually start thinking of people like, who are construction laborers. Even there, some of the cash transfers have not reached them because you need to have an ID card under the BOCW Act. So there is a lot of exclusion still. But if we can start thinking of, entire segments of population which we know are vulnerable, which we know that a lot of data is being collected, especially by state governments. For example, Jharkhand now has a full migrant database of whoever returned home, who was involved in which industry. And they are actually thinking of piloting a cash transfer scheme for about a year, for this segment of the population that returned home. So I think, it is possible to identify certain vulnerable segments, think of it, and it's not going to be so expensive because we're not talking of a universal sort of basic income, but a basic income or some unconditional cash transfer that just goes out in this phase for them to be able to revive. And one other thing that I would say in favor of cash transfers is that, one underestimates this, as Meghla was saying. This impact is still going to be played out. God only knows when the vaccine will come. God only knows when, until next year, what's going to happen. And within 3 months of the lockdown, we did a big survey on rural enterprises, which were run by women. Approximately 1/3 have closed down, and of which many are saying we will not open again. And we are talking of giving credit to these enterprises where they say we have really no wherewithal right now. It's just getting food on the table, which is why a cash transfer, as a short-term measure for these segments of the population may not be such a bad idea after all. But then once that is rolled out, you need to fix last mile checks. A lot of the farmer sort of cash transfers are, in a way, at least they're good, but at the same time, they're identified as a population. There are all these informal, daily wage laborers, landless people. They're really on that downward slope that Professor Gowda was talking about. And we need to start thinking about them as well.
So Professor Krishnamurthy, if I may come to you, any quick comments on what has just been said, and if you could also add, about say the state capacity constraints with respect to beneficiary identification when we talk about something like an emergency basic income. A lot of the fact that the identification is wrong leads to leakages, and which is, I think, a concern that especially in a constrained fiscal setup. So how would you sort of suggest the government address that?
Thanks. So I'm just responding and then to your question as well. I think there are a few things we need to think about, Mr. Vaishnav very rightly pointed out that, there was an immediate galvanization and response around, say, food grain distribution. There was also the galvanization of existing systems. I think what the last few months has shown us was that those investments have proved to be vital. I think it is worth pointing out that until this year, these were programs that were greatly vilified for exactly the reasons, for being expensive, for being leaky, for being all of this. What has saved us has been the PDS. What has saved us is having an NREGA. What has saved us is having put these systems in place. These were programs, and the same thing, states which had public procurement systems worked out. Obviously the big states, Punjab and Haryana, have done this for decades. But more recently, states like, Odisha has a paddy procurement system that it has invested in over the last several years. So does Madhya Pradesh, massive increase in procurement over the last 10 years. Those states were able to do things when it came to giving farmers and securing their Rabi harvest. States which had not invested in those systems really struggled. Right? So we have great diversity at our state levels in the strength of these systems. And I think it's very important to say upfront that firstly, those investments have paid off. We cannot afford, and we don't need a crisis to prove it. They're actually always important. But in a crisis, we have seen how vital they have been. So I think that's one important point. The second thing is, and this I think Soumya has also mentioned so eloquently, that in the design of our systems, we have focused continuously on errors of inclusion.
Right.
And we focused on errors of inclusion, and in a crisis, in a pandemic, in an emergency, when you need to include a large number of people, and you have such diversity in the kinds of contexts, whether they are migrants, whether they're sharecroppers or tenant farmers, a whole range, these errors of inclusion are really, in some cases fatal, right? So the thing is, you have to move to a system which actually focuses not on so much on errors of inclusion, but on errors of exclusion.
Right.
Now, if you want to focus on errors of exclusion, you have to decentralize. You have to have strong decentralized capacities to be able to target better, to be able to include. And again, we've seen that show up. It was very difficult to issue coupons, other kinds, and all states have tried various things to try and immediately register people. Now, for that, you need local administrative capacity to snap into action to do this. We also have to trust our people, right? So errors of inclusion happen, partly, as you're quite rightly, because you're so frightened of the fiscal repercussions, but also because you fundamentally don't trust people, whether it's bureaucrats or frontline workers or the people themselves. The assumption is that people are going to be, so this is a design problem. I'm not saying that you don't need to use technology as well as possible. You don't need to have social audits. Of course, you need all of that. But your system needs to be designed to ensure that it includes rather than excludes, particularly when you have people belonging to multiple categories of vulnerability and not a single category. So even in the case of farmers where we had PM Kisan, there has been a big problem in identifying farmers, which the Ministry of Agriculture themselves have, and there's been this debate about the number from 9 crores to 14. There's also been a well-known problem that we really struggle with sharecroppers and tenant farmers. This again is something that, Odisha in designing Kalya tried to take up in a certain way, and we saw some changes. So, to be able to better identify people again, you need local capacities, you need decentralization, you need systems that trust. So I think one very important point for us to keep in mind is that the things we invested in, the safety nets we invested in paid off, but we designed them in such a way they excluded more than they included. Going forward, we need to change this towards greater inclusion. A second point I want to make is actually the poor spend a disproportionately large amount on health and education. And unlike other kinds of social security nets, health and education have never been adequately invested in, either from a capacity point of view of making sure that they deliver well enough, but also building up a really strong public system in both of those areas, so that then the private system that comes up is actually held accountable, right? And this actually affects people's incomes. If you had strong public health and education systems, people's ability to spend on other things also goes up. Right? But our failure to invest in high quality health and education at the public system level is a big problem. I think we have to consider this as a core investment going forward once again. And finally, I just wanted to take up briefly the points on agriculture. I think, for me, for those of us who have spent some time studying Indian agriculture, it's a moment of some belatedness that people have recognized the value of agriculture in the economy. I would want to point out that in the last budget, agriculture, although as you mentioned, it was a large budget, the bulk of that was PM Kisan. But also, just to point out very importantly in that, was that agriculture was not mentioned once in the section on the economy. It came in a section on aspirational India and was really driven by a welfare narrative of giving cash transfers. Agriculture needs to be invested in as a core sector in the economy, right? And Mr. Vaishnav very rightly mentioned infrastructure, which is so critical, for agriculture, public infrastructure. Our infrastructure heads have remained unspent. That market infrastructure line in our budgets has actually remained unspent year on year. So our capacity to spend in the right places, even where we have allocated funds, is not adequate. We have, the need to invest in producer companies is now well recognized. But when you go on the ground and actually look at spending and the quality and strength of these institutions, we are not growing many Amuls, which is what we should be aiming to do, right? That requires a kind of vision for public expenditure and for, multiplier effects in agriculture, which are yet to materialize. And I mean, I would say that assuming that regulatory reform will achieve that, this is the week that we're discussing these bills in Parliament, that regulatory reform will achieve that kind of transformation is not the case. Public investment in agriculture, building agricultural institutions, building an agricultural ecosystem. Unfortunately, during this period of the last few years, global commodity prices and commodity prices across the board have actually tanked. So farmers' incomes have actually grown very, very slowly, even though doubling farmers' incomes has been one of the key things that this government has focused on, and the focus was very well appreciated. The actual reality has been that it's been a very tough time for farmers. It has followed drought, has followed, low commodity prices in the system. Very few of our farmers, only 6%, actually benefit from MSP and procurement. So the vast majority deal with the global, the market, the private market. And for example, just this week, onion exports were banned, just as, demand for onions in global markets has gone up. Now, it is very difficult to manage the trade-offs between consumers and producers. There's no doubt about it. But there are very robust proposals about how this can be done, how infrastructure can come in, how buffer stocks can be used, so that we don't turn our, obsession with inflation targeting, which I understand is very important. And farmers will be the first to tell you, because farmers are consumers as much as they are producers. It has hit farmers because we consistently take policy decisions that actually do not allow them to accumulate income and grow. And surplus sustained diversification of the economy, when farmers actually grow, when incomes actually grow, farm incomes, the way they are spent really is a sign of domestic demand. It has very complex multiplier effects. And it really pushes investment, pushes agrarian surplus, gets invested in non-agrarian work. It gets, it pushes a range of different kinds of consumption, and farmers diversify out. And that's when the rest of the economy needs to support that diversification by giving their children and other things opportunities to expand. So this kind of vision and thinking requires a lot more state capacity. It requires coordination by the center and state. It requires region-specific capacity. It requires a whole ecosystem of institutions to come up and work, all of which can then, lead to a very different way of imagining the relationship between the agrarian, the rural, small towns, and urban India. Which needs to be brought into a cohesive vision. So I think going forward, that has to be the thing. So I would say, again, these 3 points to me are the most important, that, we continue our investments, we deepen investments in health and education. We have to think about inclusion rather than exclusion, as the primary motive. So, and then finally, that we need to invest in new imagination of thinking about the rural economy and agriculture and its linkages. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Krishnamurthy. Professor Gowda, if I may come to you next. So, I mean, Professor Krishnamurthy has already hinted towards some of the reforms that the government has been trying to push, some of the structural reforms that they've been speaking about over the past couple of months. I wanted to ask you, what is your thought on that? And would you prioritize some other aspects of structural reform than what the government is prioritizing? And do you think that this will be effective in addressing some of the challenges we are facing?
See, I think I agree with her entirely that when money goes into the hands of people in rural India, the amount and the ways in which that will be spent has a very, very significant impact. And that's not just for people in rural India, it's for people in the lower economic strata. They spend a lot more, in terms of their propensity to consume. So that's why it makes more sense. It's not just a welfare argument at this point, it's also about a demand revival argument to ensure that whatever measures that we come up with put more money in the hands of, in the pockets of people who have fallen behind, who are vulnerable. Now, so we need measures of different kinds. One set of measures are related to agriculture. That it's turning into a controversy. A union minister has resigned yesterday. Basically, there's a concern that the manner in which these reforms are being pushed through as ordinances without consultation, etc., that they are really designed to actually negatively impact farmers and certain other vulnerable groups. But if we go down that path, we will turn this into a political discussion. And let's stick to the policy side. Let's think about the infrastructure that's required, right? All these years, the infrastructure that's required for getting the product, value added, value additions to the product at the farm gate, finding ways to ensure that there's better storage, better transportation, and less wastage, and the ability to have a competitive landscape where farmers can sell either in the APMC yard or elsewhere. All these things require a significant amount of fixing, okay? And some of the measures that have just been brought forth do open up the market in that sense. But I'm a farmer myself. I have always found that, I may have a Wharton PhD, when it comes to the whatever little that we grow, we immediately sell it to whoever the consolidator is, who shows up and says, I'll take your mango crop, or I'll take your coconuts, and that's it, right? I mean, I will not even spend any more effort. It's probably not even remunerative in terms of the involvement and labor and supervision, etc. So there are just so many other ways in which the real world operates. Now, how do we ensure that more returns flow to the farmer? These are some of the concerns. And I think infrastructural investments, for example, of a different kind. In Karnataka, during the last Congress government, we came up with something called the Surya Raita scheme, which was a solar pump given to farmers. This takes away the sort of dependence on the grid and on electricity, free electricity, which is a drain on the exchequer. And now, yeah, as things are improving, you will find that there's even going to be possibility of farmers becoming farmers of solar energy because they will be able to feed back into the grid, right? So this kind of investment, investment also in another program, we had a massive drip irrigation scheme. These kinds of investments will ensure that we are not going to burden the exchequer on the energy front, and so the discoms will stop becoming bankrupt. And we will stop wasting water resources if we have the ability to, manage micro irrigation more carefully. So these are all the kinds of investments that need to be put in that will change not just the life of the farmer and the farming family, who are often now headed by women, because men have moved out to the cities looking for other kinds of, they've come back. But there's a lot more women-led agriculture right now. So we have to think differently. We have to think about these kinds of interventions that will change the nature of financial flows and into farmers' families' hands, including sharecroppers, including tenant farmers, including landless labor who are left out of schemes like PM Kisan. So, and that will have an impact on the larger fiscal impact on states. It will also have an impact on how we overdraw groundwater, other kinds of ecological impacts as well. So I think these kinds of investments will absolutely be required, but these are required to be tailored to localized contexts, and that's where Megala's point that decentralization, increased state understanding of what's going on in each context, investing in the farmer-producer organizations, right? I mean, one of the concerns in this discussion about the opening up of agriculture to marketplaces is that you will see a domination by the big traders, by the big corporates, and the farmers will not have the organizational capacity to counterbalance economic and organizational power. And as she pointed out, the Amuls did not happen alone. There was a certain amount of governmental intervention and support. Similarly, we need cooperatives, we need farmer-owned organizations across a range of products, and you need investment in marketing and value addition and in safety and packaging and everything else. And so there is scope for further interventions in these domains, again, in a decentralized and carefully planned manner.
Thank you, Professor Gowda, for your comments. So what I'm hearing is you're saying that structural interventions are needed, but you would probably, there are certain aspects you would focus more on and, some other way of doing it. For instance, you're worried about concentration of power in the agricultural sector reforms. The same question actually has been raised in the context of labor reforms when we're looking at structural issues. So Mr. Vaishnav, if you would want to come in as to your opinion on, some of these reforms that are being championed, and what you think, how they will address some of the problems that we're facing in the economy.
So I would look at any economic policy primarily from employment perspective. I don't think there is any other way of looking at what should be your employment, what should be your economic thrust, what should be your way of thinking about economics. Providing sustainable, meaningful employment, that is probably the best welfare, that is probably the best growth, that is probably the best development, that is probably the best society that we can create. That's the way I think. In that way of thinking, the sectors which generate maximum employment, and that too sustainable employment, those are the sectors which are very important for all of us. Mining, manufacturing, real estate, infrastructure construction, road construction, the entire port-related services, the entire tourism sector, the entire nursing sector, let's say. These are massive employment generating sectors. If we can focus on some of these sectors and we look at what is happening globally, one thing which COVID has caused people to think is that the supply chains have to be rethought of. I frankly do not think that people are going to massively shift overnight from one place to another. No, the way supply chains will changes, they will be shrinking. As far as possible, people would like to have some critical component manufacturing as close to the final product as possible. There would be some sort of diversification geographically. There would be some sort of larger number of vendors for any component. Rather than keeping 2 vendors, people would think of having 4 vendors. So that kind of risk mitigation is definitely going to be thought of. Since I work in I have auto component units, we are seeing this day in and day out, and that is what the opportunity we need to really think of. So on the one hand, if we focus on looking at employment, looking at economy as primarily as our best weapon, best tool, best method to generate employment, and that to sustainable employment, and then looking at which are the sectors which can really bring in maximum possible employment potential. We marry the two thought processes and we come up with some real sustainable structural changes. Structural changes, such a well abused word, anybody wants to use that word, but looking at things like giving the option to sell inside a mandi and giving option to sell outside the mandi, right? And I'm sure I've worked in rural areas of Odisha. I don't know about other parts of the country, but I'm sure you would have, all of you would have seen many more parts of the country. I know of one instance when a farmer was actually killed by the mandi people, and this way back, by the mandi people, because that person decided not to sell in the mandi at the prices at which the cartel was demanding. So those kind of things are also there in front of us. We have seen it, right? I'm sure all of you would have had similar examples. We also know the example of ITC, the e-Chopal, the way it has brought a big fundamental improvement in farmers' lives, in the families' lives. So those are the things, those are the structural changes which we have to really look at. I would say focus on construction, focus on manufacturing, focus on mining, and focus on tourism related. Tourism will be a depressed sector for quite some time, and you don't need too many of structural changes there. The real changes where, I mean, I don't want to say it in any derogatory sense, but the way our system, I would say I'll use the word system, has kind of put all our entrepreneurial energy in the country. Janjiro se jakarna, it's like that. It's like we are bound by chains of our system throughout a period of ever since we got independence. We have followed primarily the thought process, which was the British thought process, where Indians have to be put down. No Indian entrepreneur should be able to come up. It is always the British companies which have to be supported. And we somehow put ourselves into a structure where even the 91 reforms were not enough for taking us out of that kind of thing, right? I tell you, as an entrepreneur, I left government way back, 2008, I took the last government salary. But as an entrepreneur, I know how difficult it is even to run a small unit. Forget what is the scenario for bigger units. So that if we can just focus on that, I'm telling you, we don't have to really worry about how energetic our people are, how many opportunities we can bring. Our people have that capacity, our people have that tenacity, have that hunger for growth, that we can, if we can just remove, if we just remove the shackles away and free our people, we can achieve a lot. And Mekhla raised a very, very important point, which I don't think we have addressed in this country significantly. Our administrative capacity at the grassroots level needs a fundamental change. Fundamental change. I'm telling you, having run 3 districts, I can tell you, I would not even take half a Sunday. Half a Sunday was a leisure, like it was like if I get a half a Sunday off in a month, then my family would be like, oh, the best thing that has happened in this month is this is what, right? That kind of hard work, if one puts in, and still I know that I could not do justice because I could not even remember the names of 1400 villages in my district. Forget what is the individual problem of each of the village. Within the village, what is the problem of each of the Sahi and Tola? Forget, and within the Sahi and Tola, what is the issues concerning each of the sections of that particular Sahi and Tola? There are hierarchies within Sahis. It's complex. It's very, very complex. We cannot run our country using the district administrative kind of setup that we took from the British, continued with it. There are districts which are bigger than countries. I mean, it's impossible. It's impossible. We really, really need to, people who are, who have seen other countries, the county system of US, the way the local government of Japan, the local government of Germany, France, you look at those systems, it's so easy to develop. Why put so much money in creating a large setup at a central level? Put all that money in creating at least one competent person, professional at every smallest of the small village level. I think it will be a big fundamental change. I think that is one sector which we all of us have ignored in last 70 years. Mekhla, thanks for bringing it up.
Great. I know we are slightly behind schedule. I hope we'll be able to finish in the next 7-8 minutes. So please bear with me. Soumya, if I may come to you, if you want to add to the wish list of structural reforms that you want seen, or if you have any comments, would you like to add here?
I mean, my one ask is, of course, to focus on some segments like women, in terms of how these reforms may pan out for women. For example, even for the agricultural, we've been doing some analysis of how FPOs work in states like Jharkhand, and although they're all run by women, it comes to actually the high-end value activities like actually taking the produce to the mandis and the markets. Really, the decisions are taken by men. I don't know if there are any structural reforms needed, quite honestly, to address that. But yes, the issue is that because the women are not really landowners in a sense, and I think the government has been trying to address that issue at one level. But at least the projects have also been quite frankly, and they are positive about it, and they have been trying to actually say that we recognize, so the state government of Jharkhand says, yes, we recognize that they are not included in these high-end value activities, and what is it that we can do about it. I think the other sort of sector which we have been working on is really the gig sector, and there's been some sort of debate around whether we should be providing them any social security or not. It's an emerging sector, particularly I can say for women, because it gives them the flexibility to have a certain number of work hours that they want to have. And we did a report with one of the gig platforms, and a lot of women, that they had a majority of female partners, as they call them. And social security is a major issue. I mean, one of the things, like, even in COVID, if you send somebody to somebody's house, you ask for them to actually disclose their Arogya Setu status, but you don't ask the customer to disclose their Arogya Setu status. So, I mean, even those sort of, pushing the partner into doing something, and you don't have, even any pensions or benefits or paid leaves or any of those things associated. But it's a huge thing that the government is trying to push, which is quite good, honestly, in a way. But there may be private sector resistance, because I've also worked with platform partners on the other side, and there's a lot of hesitation in calling them workers, because the moment you call them workers, there are a whole lot of rights that you have to take care of. So we hope to see how that discussion plays out in the gig space.
Great. Thank you. Now, let me just take one last set of comments from everyone. The budget discussions for the next year are, I think, starting. So it'll be good to hear from everyone about what are their maybe one or two top asks or hopes from the government budget as from the government as it sort of starts discussing the next budget. Professor Krishnamurthy, if I may start with you.
Yeah, I'm actually going to leave the concrete. I mean, I think we've had a lot of these talks, and I actually just, since these are my last comments, I wanted to just mention a couple of things. I would actually like the conversation to happen after the budget about how we are going to make it happen. And that is actually where the capacity questions happen. We talk a lot about what will happen before. We have a lot of demands, then we have a budget. But this is precisely where the state capacity point, it should begin after. How are you actually going to see this happen? How are you going to make sure that you absorb the money that you have allocated, that you spend it in the right ways, that your targeting is better, that we're doing all of the things that we need to do to actually have the multiplier effects that we want? So personally, I mean, there are different elements that we can think about. Clearly, agriculture, we've talked about its vitality and importance, and I would be happy to see it continue to be focused on in the budget. I certainly think the allocations for our welfare programs need to stay and be strengthened. I certainly think we need to spend on health and education and continue to see that as core elements. So I think the things that we are in a health crisis right now, COVID is a health pandemic, our health spending has never been adequate. We've never invested enough in public health and education. I think social protection and our welfare programs have proved their immense value and indispensability, whether it's NREGA or others, and I think that's it. And thirdly, agriculture. So in terms of that, but I would really love to see the conversation happen after. I want to make just two quick points, just responding in this final bit. You know, Mr. Vaishnav made this very, dramatic and important point about mandis, and you're absolutely right. We have all seen the political vested interests in these, but as Professor Gowda also said, they also play a vital role in terms of local price discovery and powers to negotiate. The most important thing is giving farmers options and choices. And I was there tracking ITC's soya chopals and e-chopals in fieldwork during that time, and they absolutely came and competed, and they made the mandi improve its own processes. But it's also true that ITC procured for 1 month or 2 months in the year, after which farmers went to the mandi. It's also true that only some farmers within the ITC network could sell to ITC. It's also true that ITC had much more stringent, quite understandably, quality controls, which meant farmers went to other options at that point, right? So I think diversity of options, credible options, is the most important thing. And this brings us to a very fundamental point, and this was, I think, a problem with our imagination of the 91 reforms as well. We assumed deregulation is about getting the state out of the way. And it is actually about imagining new capacities for the state and public institutions. Regulation requires greater capacity. Regulatory capacity is not something that we invest in building. We have now, of course, a history of now independent regulation in a number of key sectors, but building field level, serious regulatory capacity, that's true for labor, it's true for land, it's true for all our factor markets. This is very critical, and certainly in finance. So I think, just keeping that imagination. And I just wanted to say that, even states across the world, which we think of as have small government, invest less in their bureaucracies, actually, like the United States, invest much more than India by an order of magnitude in the quality of public institutions and their state. And here, I think it's very important to remember that states don't just regulate markets, they also make them. And it is about level playing fields. It is about structural investments. It's about the terms of engagements that our people have with markets. And that's going to require, a lot of innovative thinking, public commitment, and strong public institutions. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Krishnamurthy. Professor Gowda, do you want to come in with your last comments and hopes from the budget?
Well, as far as the budget is concerned, I would like to underline everything that Meghla has just, the points that she's made, but I'd also like to make 2-3 others. One, the national education policy has just been announced, and that has a very important component called early childhood care and education. And that's something that we have historically not paid enough attention to, but will make a huge difference to the, the intellectual lives and potential of our children. And so there's something that we need urgent action on, and the right training, including of a large number of women, Anganwadi workers and others, who will be expected to deliver this in the course of, and therefore need a lot more intervention. So that's one. But on a larger note, I do think that one of the challenges with the budget, with the government's numbers, has been that we have lost sight of what is true and what is not. We don't know what data is correct. If there is data that is inconvenient, that is discarded. So we're living in a very, very complicated and needlessly needlessly, what should we, delusional word. It's important that budget numbers be made facing facts as they actually are, right? And less worrying about optics and more worrying about the reality. Now, that said, one of the other issues that I would really like the budget to pay attention to is the one about the strengthening of the banking sector. You see, basically, we've been expecting that banks will go out there and lend and pump in more money. There would be an increase in credit and things like that. But that hasn't happened. The NPA burden was recognized, and as Ms. Vaishnav pointed out, there were issues related to Supreme Court judgments and other changes that caused, to some extent, the NPA crisis to emerge. And that is, we've allowed that to fester without solving the problem. So unless the budget also finds creative ways to raise money and to fix this, you're not going to see one side of a very, very crucial component, the credit side, to allow people to borrow and to invest in the economy and to revive. We will not see enough action on that front. And this is going to be a problem because after the contraction of the economy in the last quarter, the continuing contractions that I anticipate in this and probably over the next year or more, we will see a lot more loans go back. Okay, so we do need to find ways to fix that and to prevent the whole sector from practically collapsing. And so I think without it's sort of giving way to more moral hazard problems, we do need to find ways to ensure that the banking sector remains viable and solvent, and that you find a way, whether it is through more loan moratoria, through subvention of interest, different kinds of solutions to prevent the NPA problem from becoming much worse. So that actually is something that's not a sexy, major, public attention-grabbing issue, but actually it's vital to keeping the structure of our economy alive.
Thank you. Soumya, if you would want to come in with your asks from the budget, and then I'll go to Mr. Vaishnav.
No, I think Meghla and Professor Gowda have covered everything. I had couple of other things. One is, I think in the health too, one sort of more emphasis needed is actually in the primary health system, because this what we are realizing, particularly in urban areas, there is just no primary healthcare system. So even if you want to get a simple checkup done, you have to land up at the hospital, and the hospitals are being overcrowded. And that's something that public health economists have been talking about, even having an urban primary healthcare system. And there have been good models to do that. So I think even if, and I'm sure it's a really unenvious task of designing this budget, because to stimulate demand and at the same time to invest in these vital sectors. But I think within the urban, within the health segment, some emphasis on the primary systems are needed, and not just setting up more aims is what I feel, at least. I think even within education, Professor Gowda is absolutely right. I think ECD is something that one needs to invest in, but one needs to consider, and this is something we've been trying to also work with Niti Aayog as a women's organization, that do you want to invest more in Anganwadi workers? Because these are women who are tried this Anganwadi model for a very long time. It's turned out to be a nutrition model. It's not turned out to be an early childhood stimulation model. I mean, is it something that we need to, have some PPPs? Is it something that we need to actually get girls who are educated in villages, and we need to bring that cadre in? So forget the vacancies that exist. Let's not fill those vacancies for Anganwadi workers. Let's get another cadre of these education, Shiksha Didis, or whatever you might call them. So I think within ECD, there may be some innovations that can be thought about. And I think the third is MSMEs. MSMEs is in a sector that everybody is talking about. It's important for revival. A lot of people are self-employed. They're engaged in these micro nano enterprises. We don't know what is the status and what has been the impact of Mudra loans. Clearly, a lot of them are also women. But right now, it's not as much about getting money. As I said, our surveys are showing these enterprises have closed down, very low chances of revival. But if you actually use maybe innovations like having an NREGA component, subsidize, pay for their wage bill. Right now, they just need a couple of workers to run that enterprise. They're not looking at a massive loan because they don't have the repayment capacity. So some innovations around, say, an NREGA or an urban NREGA to even fund some, subsidized wage bills for SMEs could also be thought about.
Mr. Vaishnav, last comment from you.
Most dangerous question, because if I say anything, so fundamental focus has to be on continuing the support which the government is giving in terms of food security, in terms of health security, in terms of whatever we are doing for ensuring that the lives are saved. That has to continue, one. Two, the new education policy which Professor Gowda referred is a historical, it's a landmark change again that needs lots and lots of focus on implementation. And as Mekhla said, it is about capacities, and it is not just about removing regulation, but also about creating new capacities. So that is where a lot of funds will have to go. And what Samya said, the primary health care sector has been ignored. It is practically over last 50, 60, 70 years. I don't think it is whatever work I did in Sundargarh district, in Balasore, in Cuttack areas, it just does not exist anywhere in the rural areas. It just does not exist. I didn't think from the urban perspective, Soumya, when you said this, it struck me how powerful your point was. Today, even for a small, you are very right, for a small checkup, you have to go to a big hospital. And that is definitely going to be third wish list on my part. And the fourth most important wish list will be that at least 25% of the NIP, at least 25%, which means about 25 lakh crore worth projects, must be sanctioned within this year. I know it will take 2-3 years to actually get that multiplier effect, but if we don't start now, then it will be too late. So these are my 4 wish lists.
Great, great. Thank you so much. So I just want to thank all the panelists for their brilliant insights. I think undoubtedly this is a very difficult period with no easy answers. But the best thing I think all of us can do is have consensus people and our best minds come together and try and address this together. So thank you so much for your insights. Personally, it was very enjoyable for me, and I'm sure that our listeners will really enjoy listening to your viewpoint.